The ice-cold wind whipped across the Delaware River on Christmas night of 1776, carrying with it the desperate hopes of a dying revolution. General George Washington stood at the river bank, his weathered face etched with the weight of a nation's future, as he watched his ragtag Continental Army prepare for what many believed would be their final gamble. The revolution hung by a thread thinner than the ice forming on the dark waters before them. Washington's army had been in full retreat for months. Driven from New York by British forces under General William Howe, the defeats at Brooklyn Heights and Fort Washington had shattered American morale. While the British campaign had seemed unstoppable, now, with enlistments expiring at year's end and desertions mounting daily, the Continental Army faced complete dissolution. Thomas Paine's words echoed in the bitter December air. These are the times that try men's souls. The general's piercing blue eyes surveyed his men, fewer than 2,400 soldiers remaining. From what had once been a force of nearly 20,000, many were barefoot, their feet leaving bloody trails in the snow, others wrapped, their feet in rags torn from their own clothing. Yet something flickered in their eyes that Washington recognized, not defeat, but defiance. They had followed him through hell itself, and they would follow him once more. Colonel John Glover's Marblehead fishermen had been tasked with the impossible ferrying the entire army across the treacherous Delaware in the dead of winter. These seasoned mariners from Massachusetts had saved the army before during the retreat from Brooklyn, and now they would attempt another miracle. The Durham boats, normally used for hauling iron, or bobbed ominously in the choppy waters, their flat bottoms designed for cargo, not desperate men fleeing toward their last chance at victory. According to historical accounts from the New York Historical Society, the decision to cross the Delaware represented Washington's most audacious gamble. Intelligence reports indicated that Colonel Johann Rahl's Hessian garrison at Trenton had grown complacent, celebrating Christmas with typical German thoroughness. The mercenaries, fighting for pay rather than principle, had reportedly dismissed the possibility of an American attack during the holiday season. Washington's war council had been divided. Some officers argued for retreat into Pennsylvania's interior, hoping to preserve what remained of the army through the winter. Others suggested surrender negotiations before more blood was spilled. But Washington understood what his subordinates perhaps did not. That retreat meant death by degrees, while bold action offered the slim possibility of resurrection. The plan was audacious in its simplicity. 3 separate crossings would occur simultaneously. Washington would lead the main force of 2,400 men across at McConkey's Ferry, while Colonel John Cadwalader would cross with 1,800 Pennsylvania militia near Bristol, and General James Ewing would take 700 men across at Trenton Ferry. The coordinated assault would strike the Hessian garrison at dawn, catching them unprepared after their Christmas celebrations died as darkness deepened on Christmas night. Washington mounted his horse and addressed his officers one final time. His voice carried across the frozen ground with quiet authority. We must beat the enemy or die trying. The fate of American independence would be decided in the next few hours. Balanced on the edge of a blade as sharp as the winter wind, cutting through their threadbare uniforms, the first boats pushed off from the Pennsylvania shore at 6 o'clock in the evening, their hulls scraping against the ice formations that had begun forming along the river bank. Colonel Glover barked orders to his Marblehead fishermen, their experienced hands working the oars with practiced precision despite the numbing cold. The Delaware, swollen with winter rains and choked with ice floes, fought them at every stroke. Washington himself stepped into the lead boat, his massive frame filling the stern as he maintained his characteristic composure. Behind him, the Continental Army began its perilous journey across the dark waters. Artillery pieces had to be carefully balanced in the Durham boats, their weight threatening to capsize the vessels with every shift in the current. General Nathaniel Greene supervised the loading of the 18-pounder cannons, knowing that their firepower would be crucial in the coming battle. The weather grew worse as the hours passed. What had begun as a cold December evening transformed into a full northeaster, with sleet and snow driving horizontally across the river. The storm that threatened to doom their crossing also provided perfect cover for their approach. No sentry would expect an attack in such conditions, and the howling wind would mask the sound of their movements. Captain Alexander Hamilton, then a young artillery officer, struggled to keep his guns from sliding off the boats as ice formed on every surface. The future Secretary of the Treasury would later recall how the men's hands became so numb they could barely grip their muskets, yet not a single soldier complained. They understood that this night would determine whether they would live as free men. or die as traitors to the crown, Lieutenant James Monroe, who would one day become the 5th President of the United States, helped steady the boats as they navigated between the ice floes. The 19-year-old officer had already proven his courage in previous battles, and his steady presence helped calm the younger soldiers who trembled from more than just the cold. The future author of the Monroe Doctrine watched as chunks of ice the size of millstones crashed against their boats, threatening to stave in the wooden hulls. By 11 o'clock, the crossing had fallen dangerously behind schedule. The storm had intensified, making navigation treacherous even for Glover's experienced mariners. Ice began forming on the men's clothing, creating a crystalline armor that restricted their movements. Some soldiers' muskets became so encrusted with ice that they would need to be thawed before firing. Washington, observing the delays, made a fateful decision to continue despite the worsening conditions. The general's resolve never wavered, even as reports reached him that the other decrossings had failed. Cadwalader's force had been turned back by the ice, unable to get their artillery across the river. Ewing's men had also failed to cross, leaving Washington's force to face the enemy alone. What had been planned as a coordinated three-pronged attack had become a desperate single thrust into enemy territory. As detailed in records from the Smithsonian Institute, the psychological impact of the crossing cannot be overstated. These men had been in constant retreat for months, losing battle after battle, watching their cause seemingly collapse around them, yet here they were, voluntarily marching toward an enemy stronghold in the worst weather imaginable. The transformation from a defeated rabble into a determined fighting force began on those dark waters. By 2 o'clock in the morning, the last of the army had reached the New Jersey shore. The men gathered in small groups, stamping their feet and blowing on their hands to restore circulation. Their uniforms, such as they were, had frozen solid in places. Many wrapped blankets around their shoulders like ancient warriors preparing for battle. The sight of their faces, illuminated by the occasional lantern, revealed a mixture of exhaustion and grim determination. Washington counted his forces and found them surprisingly intact. Despite the harrowing crossing, not a single man had been lost to the river. It seemed a divine providence smiled upon their desperate venture. The general checked his pocket watch. They were 3 hours behind schedule, but they had crossed the Rubicon. There could be no turning back now. The Continental Army formed ranks on the New Jersey shore, their frozen breath creating ghostly clouds in the pre-dawn darkness. Washington divided his force into 2 columns for the 9-mile march to Trenton, knowing that speed and coordination would be essential to their success. General Nathanael Greene would lead the larger column along the Pennington Road, while General John Sullivan would take the River Road. Approaching the town from the southwest. The march began at 4 o'clock in the morning, with the men struggling through snow that had deepened to 6 inches. Their footsteps left a trail of blood on the white ground, as many soldiers had wrapped their feet in strips of cloth or marched barefoot entirely. The storm continued to rage, driving sleet into their faces and making every step a battle against the elements. Yet the same tempest that tortured them also provided perfect concealment from enemy scouts. Washington rode between the columns, his presence alone worth a regiment to the morale of his men. The general had wrapped his dark blue cloak around his shoulders, but refused the offer of gloves, keeping his hands free to grip the reins and gesture commands. His white horse, Nelson, picked his way carefully through the treacherous footing, the animal's breath steaming in the frigid air. Behind them, the cannons of Captain Hamilton's battery left deep ruts in the snow-covered road. The men marched in relative silence, understanding that their lives depended on maintaining the element of surprise. Occasionally, a soldier would slip on the icy ground, his musket clattering against the frozen earth. Officers would quickly help him to his feet, and the column would continue its steady advance. The sound of their passage was masked by the howling wind and the crunch of snow. Beneath hundreds of feet. At Barring's Tavern, roughly halfway to their destination, Washington called a brief halt to rest his men and synchronize his pocket watch with his subordinate commanders. The general's face showed the strain of the night's ordeal, but his voice remained steady as he issued final instructions. Greene's column would enter Trenton from the north, while Sullivan's would approach from the west. The artillery would be positioned to command the 2 main streets, preventing any organized Hessian resistance. The intelligence gathered by American spies proved invaluable during the final approach. Reports indicated that Colonel Rahl had indeed celebrated Christmas with considerable enthusiasm, consuming large quantities of wine and beer with his officers. The Hessian commander had dismissed warnings from loyalist sources about possible American activity, confident that no army would dare move in such weather. His complacency would prove fatal to his garrison and to himself, as detailed in accounts from the Library of Congress. The discipline displayed by the Continental Army during this march represented a remarkable transformation. These same men, who had fled in panic from British bayonets just months earlier, now moved with quiet purpose through a winter storm toward an enemy stronghold. The crucible of defeat had forged them into something harder and more determined than before. Young James Monroe, marching with the advance guard, spotted the first signs of Trenton ahead, chimney smoke rising from the houses where the Hessians slept. The town lay in a valley, surrounded by hills that would provide excellent positions for the American artillery. The Delaware River curved around the settlement like a protective arm, but today it would serve as a trap, preventing the enemy from escaping across the frozen waters. By 7 o'clock in the morning, both columns had reached their assigned positions. Around Trenton, the storm had begun to abate, though snow continued to fall steadily. Washington drew his sword and looked back at his men one final time. Their faces, drawn with exhaustion and cold, nonetheless showed a fierce determination that had been absent during the dark days of the retreat. They had crossed their Delaware, and now they would claim their prize. The general raised his blade toward the sleeping town below. In a few minutes, the sound of battle would shatter the Christmas morning quiet. The fate of American independence hung in the balance, decided by fewer than 2,400 men who had chosen to risk everything rather than surrender their dream of freedom. The hour of decision had arrived. The first shot of the Battle of Trenton rang out at 8 o'clock in the morning on December 26, 1776, as American sentries encountered a Hessian patrol returning from its rounds. The crack of musket fire shattered the winter silence, and within moments, the town erupted into chaos. Washington's carefully planned assault had begun, and there would be no turning back. Captain Alexander Hamilton's artillery battery thundered into action, their cannons positioned at the head of King Street and Queen Street, the two main thoroughfares that formed the heart of Trenton. The 18-pounder guns roared in succession, their shot crashing through the wooden buildings where Hessian soldiers stumbled from their beds, struggling to comprehend what was happening. The sound of splintering wood and shattering glass, mixed with the shouts of confused men and the steady beat of American drums. Colonel Johann Rahl, commander of the Hessian garrison, had been awakened by his adjutant with news of the attack. The veteran officer, still suffering from the previous night's Christmas celebration, initially dismissed the reports as minor skirmishing. It was only when a cannonball crashed through his headquarters window that he realized the gravity of the situation. Stumbling into his uniform, Rahl attempted to organize a defense, but his men were scattered throughout the town, many still recovering from their holiday festivities. The American assault came from multiple directions simultaneously, exactly as Washington had planned. General Greene's column poured down from the north, their bayonets gleaming in the gray morning light. General Sullivan's force swept in from the west, cutting off the Hessian retreat routes. The Continental soldiers, their blood warmed by action, after the long cold march, fought with a ferocity that surprised even their own officers. Lieutenant James Monroe, leading a section of infantry, found himself engaged in fierce hand-to-hand combat with Hessian grenadiers near the town central square. The future president's uniform was torn by a musket ball, but he pressed forward, his men following closely behind. The professional soldiers they faced were formidable opponents, trained in the best military traditions of Europe, but they had been caught completely off guard by the American assault. As documented in military records from the National Archives, the psychological impact of the surprise attack proved devastating to Hessian morale. These mercenaries, fighting for pay rather than principle, had no particular investment in holding American territory. When faced with determined resistance and the possibility of death far from home, many began to waver. The Americans, conversely, fought with the desperation of men who knew that defeat meant the gallows. The battle raged through the streets of Trenton for over an hour. With neither side able to gain a decisive advantage, Hessian officers attempted to rally their men around the two main streets, but Hamilton's artillery made any organized formation impossible. The young captain, his face blackened with gunpowder, directed his cannon fire with deadly precision, systematically destroying every attempt at Hessian resistance. Captain William Washington, the general's cousin, led a cavalry charge that broke through a Hessian defensive line near the Assunpink Creek. His horse was shot from under him, but he continued fighting on foot, his sword cutting through the enemy ranks. The sight of American officers willing to risk their lives alongside their men inspired the Continental soldiers to extraordinary efforts. Colonel Rahl, attempting to organize one final counterattack, was mortally wounded by American musket fire. The Hessian commander, struck in the side by the bullets, fell from his horse and was carried to a nearby house where he would die within hours. His death effectively ended any coordinated resistance, as his subordinate officers found themselves unable to control their scattered forces. The turning point came when General Sullivan's men captured the bridge over the Assunpink Creek, cutting off the primary Hessian escape route. Trapped between the American forces and the frozen Delaware River, the remaining Hessians began to surrender in large numbers. White flags appeared at windows throughout the town, and the sound of gunfire gradually died away. Washington himself rode into the town square as the battle concluded, his presence immediately recognizable to both friend and foe. The general's uniform was splattered with mud and snow, but his bearing remained as dignified as ever. He surveyed the scene of American victory with satisfaction, knowing that this moment would transform the Revolution from a desperate flight into a war of liberation. The Battle of Trenton had lasted less than 2 hours, but its impact would resonate throughout the American colonies and across the Atlantic to the courts of Europe. The Continental Army had not merely survived, they had won a decisive victory against professional European soldiers. The myth of American military incompetence had been shattered forever. On the snow-covered streets of a small New Jersey town, the aftermath of the Battle of Trenton revealed the magnitude of Washington's tactical triumph. American casualties numbered fewer than 10 men, with only 2 soldiers killed in action during the entire engagement. In stark contrast, the Hessian forces had suffered catastrophic losses, over 100 dead and wounded, with nearly 900 taken prisoner. The professional soldiers who had seemed invincible just hours earlier now stood in dejected columns, their weapons stacked in neat piles under American guard. General Washington walked among the captured Hessians, his bearing dignified yet compassionate. Many of the prisoners were young men, far from their homes in the German principalities, fighting in a war that held no personal meaning for them. The general ordered that they be treated with honor due to prisoners of war, a decision that would enhance American reputation throughout Europe. Word of this magnanimous treatment would reach the courts of France and Prussia, helping to establish the Continental Army's legitimacy. The captured supplies proved as valuable as the prisoners themselves. The Hessians had been well equipped by British quartermasters, and their stores included desperately needed muskets, ammunition, and artillery pieces. Captain Hamilton supervised the inventory of captured cannon, counting 6 brass field pieces that would significantly strengthen American firepower. Medical supplies, food, and winter clothing were distributed immediately to Washington's men, many of whom had been on the verge of starvation. Lieutenant James Monroe, his uniform still torn from the morning's fighting, helped organize the prisoner march back toward the Delaware. The young officer noted in his diary the remarkable transformation in his fellow soldiers' demeanor. The men who had crossed the river in desperate silence now laughed and joked as they secured their captives. Victory had restored their confidence and their belief in their cause. The intelligence gathered from captured Hessian officers provided Washington with crucial information about British dispositions. Throughout New Jersey, Colonel Rahl's papers revealed that other enemy garrisons at Princeton and New Brunswick were similarly unprepared for American attacks. This knowledge would prove invaluable in planning future operations as the Continental Army prepared to press their advantage. As reported in contemporary accounts from the Pennsylvania Gazette, news of the victory spread rapidly throughout the American colonies. Riders carried dispatches to Philadelphia, where the Continental Congress had been preparing for potential evacuation. The delegates, who had been debating whether to abandon the capital, instead began planning for expanded military operations. The victory at Trenton had given them something precious: hope. The psychological impact of the victory extended far beyond military considerations. American morale, which had reached its lowest point during the retreat across New Jersey, suddenly soared. Militia units that had disbanded during the dark days of November began to reassemble. Farmers who had been considering accommodation with British authorities instead began hiding their grain from enemy foraging parties. The Revolution had found its second wind. Washington recognized that his victory, while significant, was incomplete. The British still held New York and most of New Jersey, and they would certainly respond to this setback with increased force. Moreover, many of his soldiers' enlistments would expire at year's end, just 5 days away. The general needed to consolidate his gains while planning for the challenges ahead. The treatment of wounded soldiers, both American and Hessian, demonstrated the civilized nature of Washington's army. Dr. John Cochran, the Army's chief physician, established a field hospital in Trenton's Presbyterian Church, treating all wounded men regardless of their nationality. This humane behavior, unusual for 18th century warfare, further enhanced American reputation among European observers. The logistics of managing nearly 900 prisoners presented unexpected challenges. The Continental Army lacked adequate transportation and guard personnel to move such a large number of captives. Washington decided to march them to Philadelphia, where they could be properly housed and fed. The sight of these professional soldiers being led through American towns would provide a powerful propaganda boost for the Patriot cause. As evening approached on December 26th, Washington stood on the steps of Trenton's courthouse, watching his men prepare for the night's rest. The general's face showed the exhaustion of the past 48 hours, but his eyes held a satisfaction that had been absent for months. They had crossed the Delaware, fought a battle, and emerged victorious. The American cause lived, and with it, the dream of independence. The victory at Trenton had transformed the Continental Army from a collection of defeated refugees into a confident fighting force. But Washington knew that greater challenges lay ahead. The British would not underestimate American capabilities again, and the war would likely continue for years. Still, on this December evening in 1776, the general allowed himself a moment of quiet satisfaction. They had won their first real victory, and America was still free. The return journey across the Delaware River began at sunset on December 26, 1776, as Washington's victorious army prepared to ferry their prisoners and captured supplies back to Pennsylvania. The crossing that had seemed so perilous 18 hours earlier now carried the weight of triumph, though the dangers remained as real as ever. The ice-choked waters that had nearly doomed their advance now threatened to claim their victory. Colonel John Glover's Marblehead fishermen once again proved their worth, organizing the complex logistics of transporting nearly 900 Hessian prisoners, along with the Continental Army's original force. The Durham boats, which had carried desperate men toward an uncertain fate, now bore the fruits of American victory. Captured artillery pieces were carefully loaded, their brass barrels gleaming despite the gray December light. The Hessian prisoners, many still bewildered by their sudden reversal of fortune, were distributed among the boats under careful guard. These professional soldiers, who had marched confidently through New Jersey just weeks earlier, now found themselves captives of the ragtag army they had been sent to suppress. Their uniforms, so pristine during their Christmas celebrations, were now torn and muddy from the morning's battle. Washington supervised the crossing personally, his presence ensuring that no detail was overlooked. The general understood that losing his prisoners to the treacherous river would diminish the propaganda value of his victory. More importantly, he recognized that the humane treatment of captives would enhance American reputation throughout Europe, potentially leading to foreign recognition and support for the Patriot cause. The weather had moderated slightly since the previous night's storm, but the Delaware remained a formidable obstacle. Ice floes continued to drift with the current, threatening to crush the heavily laden boats. Captain Hamilton's artillery pieces, captured from the Hessians, proved particularly challenging to transport. The young officer directed the loading with the same precision he had shown during the battle, understanding that these cannon would be crucial for future operations. As documented in records from the Delaware Historical Society, the Army's morale during the return crossing stood in stark contrast to their desperate state. 24 hours earlier, soldiers who had crossed in grim silence now exchanged stories of the battle, their voices carrying across the water despite orders for quiet. The transformation was remarkable. Defeat had been replaced by confidence, despair by hope. Lieutenant James Monroe, his wounded arm bound with strips torn from a Hessian uniform, helped guide one of the prisoner boats across the current. The future president observed how quickly the dynamic between captor and captive had been established. The American guards, many of whom had been in full retreat just days earlier, now carried themselves with the bearing of victorious soldiers. The crossing took nearly 4 hours to complete, with the last boat reaching the Pennsylvania shore well after dark. Torches were lit along the river bank to guide the final vessels. their flickering light reflecting off the icy water. Washington stood at the landing, personally counting each man and prisoner as they disembarked. Not a single soul had been lost to the river during either crossing, a fact that many would later attribute to divine providence. The captured Hessian officers were quartered separately from their men, receiving treatment appropriate to their rank. Colonel Rahl, mortally wounded during the battle, had died during the afternoon, his last words reportedly expressing regret for underestimating American determination. His death removed any possibility of prisoner exchange, but it also eliminated the most experienced enemy commander in the region. The intelligence value of the captured documents proved immediately apparent. Maps found in Rahl's headquarters revealed British dispositions throughout New Jersey, including the locations of supply depots and communication routes. This information would guide Washington's strategic planning for the coming weeks. As he prepared to exploit his victory at Trenton, the Continental Army's commissary officers worked through the night to inventory the captured. Supplies, muskets, ammunition, food, and medical supplies were cataloged and distributed to units that had been desperately undersupplied. The Hessian artillery pieces were examined by American gunners, who found them to be of superior quality to most Continental ordnance. As the Army established its camp on the Pennsylvania side of the Delaware, Washington called his senior officers together for a council of war. The general's appearance reflected the strain of the past 2 days. His uniform was torn and muddy, his face drawn with exhaustion. Yet his voice remained steady as he outlined his plans. For the immediate future, the victory at Trenton had been achieved, but Washington understood that it was merely the first step. In a longer campaign, British forces would soon respond to this setback, and the Continental Army needed to be prepared for their counterattack. The general's strategic vision extended beyond the immediate tactical success to the broader implications for American independence. The men who had crossed the Delaware as a defeated army, now prepared to defend their hard-won victory, they had proven that American forces could defeat professional European soldiers, shattering the myth of continental incompetence. The revolution had found its momentum, and there would be no turning back from the path toward independence. The news of Washington's victory at Trenton spread across the American colonies like wildfire, transforming the political and military landscape of the Revolution. Within days, express riders had carried word to Philadelphia, where the Continental Congress erupted in celebration. Delegates who had been preparing for potential evacuation instead began drafting proclamations of renewed confidence in the American cause. The psychological impact of the victory extended far beyond the immediate military success. For months, American morale had been steadily declining as British forces seemed to win battle after battle. The defeats at New York had convinced many colonists that independence was impossible against the might of the British Empire. Now, suddenly, the Continental Army had proven that professional European soldiers could be defeated by American determination and ingenuity. Recruitment, which had virtually ceased during the dark days of the retreat, began to surge throughout Pennsylvania and New Jersey. Young men who had been reluctant to join what appeared to be a losing cause now flocked to Continental Army camps. Militia units that had disbanded during the November retreat began to reassemble, their officers receiving new commissions from state governments emboldened by Washington's success. The European courts took notice of the American victory with considerable interest. French diplomats, who had been skeptical of American military capabilities, began to reconsider their position on providing aid to the rebels. The victory at Trenton suggested that the Continental Army might be capable of sustained resistance against British forces, making American independence a realistic possibility rather than a romantic dream. British reaction to the defeat was swift and decisive. General William Howe, commanding British forces in New York, immediately began planning a counteroffensive to retake Trenton and crush Washington's army. Before it could consolidate its gains, additional Hessian and British regiments were ordered to New Jersey, and Loyalist militia units were activated to support the coming campaign. Washington, meanwhile, recognized that his victory was incomplete. The British still controlled most of New Jersey, and they would certainly respond with overwhelming force. The general's strategic vision extended beyond the immediate tactical success to the broader implications for American independence. He understood that the Continental Army needed to win more battles to maintain the momentum gained at Trenton. The treatment of Hessian prisoners became a significant factor in American propaganda efforts. Unlike the harsh treatment often accorded to captives in 18th century warfare. Washington insisted that his prisoners be treated with dignity and respect. This policy not only enhanced American reputation among European observers, but also encouraged future enemy surrenders. As referenced in contemporary accounts from the Virginia Gazette, the victory at Trenton marked a fundamental shift in the character of the American Revolution. What had begun as a colonial rebellion against British taxation had evolved into a war for independence, with Washington's army proving that American forces could defeat the professional soldiers of European powers. The intelligence gathered from captured Hessian documents provided Washington with detailed information about British dispositions throughout New Jersey. This knowledge would prove invaluable in planning future operations. As the Continental Army prepared to press their advantage, the general's staff worked throughout the night of December 26th, analyzing maps and correspondence found in Colonel Rawls' headquarters. The logistical challenges of managing nearly 900 prisoners stretched the Continental Army's limited resources. However, the captured supplies more than compensated for this burden. Hessian muskets, artillery pieces, and ammunition significantly strengthened American firepower, while food and medical supplies provided immediate relief to Washington's men. The political implications of the victory extended throughout the 13 colonies. State governments that had been wavering in their support for independence now renewed their commitments to the patriot cause. The victory proved that American forces could achieve military success against professional European armies, making independence seem achievable rather than merely desirable. As December 26th drew to a close, Washington stood once again on the banks of the Delaware River, watching the last of his men establish their camps. The general's face showed the exhaustion of the past 48 hours, but his eyes held a satisfaction that had been absent for months. They had crossed the Delaware, fought a battle, and emerged victorious. The victory at Trenton had transformed the Continental Army from a collection of defeated refugees into a confident fighting force. More importantly, it had revitalized the American cause at its darkest hour. The men who had crossed the Delaware in desperate silence now prepared for the battles ahead. With renewed confidence in their ultimate victory, the Revolution had found its second wind, and the dream of American independence lived on. The crossing of the Delaware had become more than a military maneuver. It had become a symbol of American determination and the willingness to risk everything for freedom. In the annals of history, December 25th and 26th, 1776, would be remembered as the moment when the tide of revolution turned and a new nation began its journey toward independence.